Which is better, the Rolex Explorer or Explorer 2? I love this question. Now please, before we get going, don't take this seriously. We can end the discussion by just saying whatever suits your tastes. But the thinking behind this exercise is to look at both of them, break them down, look at their histories very briefly, discuss their design aesthetics and just how well these two watches represent their field of exploration. So we begin with the Explorer, going up Everest, blah blah, Hillary, Norgay, we know the story. The Explorer, as a watch, is a marketing masterpiece. Made as a commemorative Oyster Perpetual, its aesthetics had zero relevance to the Everest expedition, but the resulting watch captured 50s design motifs and has since transformed it into an icon of the Rolex brand. There were many renditions of the Explorer, like the 5500, but the 1016 is the watch that truly established the image and remained the longest, well over 20 years. The Explorer was never seen to be this grandiose watch back in the day. It had an excellent story, or should we say inspiration behind the name and the identity, but it just looks like an everyday watch. And what makes it work so well is it has this image of being not only a sports watch, but something that can be worn on formal occasions. It has a near perfect balance of formality and informality. So what you get as a result is a watch that looks fairly utilitarian, quite neutral in appearance, but masterfully displays all of Rolex's key traits, like the triangle at the 12, the Mercedes hour hand, the fully loomed dial, the oyster case, oyster bracelet, jubilee bracelet. But the issue with this watch, the 1016, back in the day, we could say the 1970s, is it didn't really portray the masculine nature of a watch to climb up mountains. Even now when we look at it, it doesn't appear to be masculine. The design is so incredible that it actually looks neutral. There's no bias in a certain direction. And visually what that means is the watch doesn't exude this quality of being a hardcore adventurer's instrument. It might have been 20 years before the time in the 50s, but by the time we reach the 70s, we see how aesthetics have changed. We see how demand has become so different. And so, as a result of some of the most bizarre experiments ever made by the brand, they produce the 1655. This piece built to be something more aligned with the adventurer. And when looking at it, the quality that this watch has over the 1016 is it shows how much more beefed up the design became. What it lacks next to the 1016 is elegance. And instead it replaces this elegance with what we could safely say an almost militaristic image, with aggression. Not only do we have a date complication, but we have a 24-hour indicator, much more practical for the likes of spelunking and cave exploring. In certain parts of the world where the sun neither rises nor sets, it's extremely practical for all of those ventures. The case being thicker, more sturdier, the crown now protected by crown guards. The watch now has a greater presence on the wrist, making it all the more practical to read. As most of us probably know, this watch wasn't very popular back in the day, and the oversight might have been that Rolex didn't consider that their audience wasn't interested in the idea of a watch that they could barely discern. The image of this watch, it doesn't look like Rolex at all. We also shouldn't forget that the watches that were popular at the time were the Submariners, the GMTs, the Datejusts. Maybe Rolex misunderstood their market. Maybe it was that the design was overlooked, or that so few were just not interested in the watch itself. But the result is that the 1016 still remained and lasted all the way through until the late 80s, while the Explorer 2 disappeared for a while until resurfacing. The format of this watch was now completely different. And an interesting story around this is it was partly due to Oliver Shepherd, a British explorer, who was given one of these 1655s and opted for a GMT dial instead of the conventional, almost racing dial layout that it was known for. The result was this transitional Explorer that looked very much like your standard GMT, just with a stainless steel bezel. And as we know, what came from that were the later references of the Explorer 2 line. It's only been up until this point in time where the Explorer 2 has gained so much attention and traction. That's partly due to the fact that Submariners and GMTs and the like are still very sought after. Their prices have gone through the roof, while Explorer 2s are still relatively attainable in the scheme of things. And across from that, we see that the 1016 Explorer was phased out in favor of 5-digit and 6-digit references, also boasting a 36mm size, but now transitioning into the modern era of Rolex's design identity. We see now that these watches have a different numeral layout, that the batons and the plots are applied indexes. There feels to be a lot more detail put into these pieces, and the concept of the Explorer watch has been solidified with elements like an oyster locking safety clasp. The Explorer 2 has moved from strength to strength, now being scaled up into a 42mm format. The design cues that made the original 1655 so important, like the orange GMT hand, has been reintroduced, and as a set of polar white or black dial variants. There is such a great area to choose. Whether you want the more modern 6-digit references or 5-digit models, what you're getting is a watch that rides the line of being both functionally complete, visually complicated, while also having components like a GMT complication and a date to make for an excellent everyday wearing watch. We see how the 5-digit reference Explorer transitioned to the 6-digit and the now modern 214270. And when we compare where the watch sits now compared to how it originated, as this dainty, small, discreet commemorative model, at this point in time the modern Explorer expresses how Rolex has transcended into the modern era. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it really is down to the purist or the enthusiast to decide. Some might say that what made the Explorer such an excellent watch was its level of discreetness. And the question that we have to ask is whether these modern watches manage to portray that same effect nowadays. We know that the identity of the brand has changed so much since then. Size and presence seems to be one of the most important aspects that the brand intends to deliver. And this goes both ways. On one side, you're getting a watch that you can read easier, but on the other side, you're getting a watch that looks more, shall I say, ostentatious. Now it's down to answering the question of whether the Explorer or the Explorer 2 is the better choice. And of course, it's really down to what you use them for. If you intend on wearing a watch every day, you're someone that needs a date, you're someone that needs a GMT complication because you travel a lot or you work in a different time zone, the Explorer 2 makes an excellent option. If you're not someone who's interested in the complex workings of watches and just want something that tells the time, then of course the original Explorer works perfectly for you then. But let's eliminate that. Let's eliminate bias and break it down completely. What was the true intention behind the watch in the first place? Was there a need for the Explorer to have a complication to tell you the date or a different time zone? Was there a need to create a watch that looks almost identical to the GMT and the Submariner visually? The only real difference that divides them, at least to those who don't know much about watches, is the steel bezel. When I look at the Oyster Perpetual Explorer, I see a watch that understands its place. By the way it presents itself, it doesn't scream, it whispers. Does a watch of this caliber need a thicker case, crown guards, or even more presence? Was it the watch's discretion that made it so appealing back in the day? Was it the simplicity of being able to determine the time quickly that made it practical? And I guess to answer this question with a question, does an instrument of this caliber need to be complicated for the sake of it? As bad as it might be for someone like me to admit, when I look at the Explorer 2, I see it to be a watch that has tacked on features. Not that they don't work. The elements just don't feel as pure, as thought through as the former. It takes a lot of courage for a brand to do so little and produce something that has such a presence, that makes such a statement. But then in saying that, the Explorer and the Explorer 2 are in different camps. We could say, looking at this from a bird's eye view, that the Explorer is for the city slicker and the Explorer 2 is for someone who actively goes out. And returning back to the preference argument, depending on what you do, you might want that extra security. You might feel more assured that the watch is larger in size, that the crown is protected, that the dial is open and can be read easily, that the date complication can help with your coordination wherever you are going. In a situation where you might get lost, you might need to know 24-hour time. So what the Explorer lacks and what the Explorer 2 has is what we could say, safety net. The watch has been built around this idea of being a more acceptable modern utility. Is there a clear answer about which is best? Should my opinion on this even matter? If you're wanting something that pays a closer tribute to the mind of the 50s Explorer, the Explorer 1 is perfect. If you want something that pays closer tribute to the minds of the 1970s and beyond, up until this modern point in time, then the Explorer 2 is yours. Regardless, what both of these models managed to do over the professionals that we know so well of today is still, even at this point in time, managed to fly under the radar. Even with their larger sizes, They are still discreet. They offer an immense amount of detail. They are very clear examples that show where the modern Rolex brand is at this point in time. Ultimately, are both watches that can guide you in the right direction.